I'm excited to introduce Dave Dulabon, Associate General Counsel, Clint Schmidt, who joins us from the Office of Research Protections. He's the Director of the Conflict of Interest Program, and John Hanold, the Associate Vice President for Research and Director of the Office of Sponsored Program. We'll ask the three of you to go on stage. We'll get your presentation together. In the meantime, any additional questions for any of our previous speakers who are still in the room? Jim, Harl? All right.
Okay, great. And then how do I go to that one?
To minimize and come in here and open these.
Okay, so when that's open, minimize it, hit escape.
Yep, so I'll open here.
Okay.
So you guys are ready.
Yeah.
And then you just need to toggle.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Should I just do? Oh, they're right. They're right.
No.
Oh, it just goes there. Gotcha.
Yep.
Which one's the
So that's 7.
7? Yeah.
And then 6.
Great. Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Great. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for the invitation to be here. Again, my name is David Dulabon, Associate General Counsel in Penn State's Office of General Counsel, and I am pleased to be here with my friends and colleagues Clint Schmidt and John Hanold, realizing that this is the last full presentation of the day that is sitting between you being in this room and this glorious day on the Penn State University campus, but we will make this hour worth your while. So, as we're here to talk about trouble-free contracting, how to issue an SBIR subcontract. So, let's get right into things. My apologies, we'll get this going to the next slide. Or should I just... there we go. Oh, just page it up and down. Okay. Gotta go.
This is not good.
Oh, that didn't go. Sorry, there's a little technical difficulties here. We'll get this this ship righted.
Sorry.
Oh, that's okay. Let's see here. Do we have our technical assistants available? Sorry about that. It's working on the screen, but not on the projector here. My apologies.
Maybe exit out and go back in. I already did that.
Oh, it's not advancing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can close it out.
Save it. Try again.
That's it.
Hey, there we go. Great. Thank you. Look at that. Innovation before our eyes, right? So as we likely know by now, the SBIR program, SBIR grants, are grants given to small businesses by the federal government. And there are two goals of the SBIR program. It's 1, for the government to receive the research deliverable, and 2, to stimulate small business. Now we also, as we've learned today, the Small Business Technology Transfer, or STTR program, has similar goals. But the small business receiving an STTR grant award must collaborate with nonprofit research institutions. So as we've learned today, what is Penn State's role in all this? We are a subcontractor to a small business. We are not a small business. We have noticed an increase in government scrutiny on SBIR contracts. And we've noticed this through publicly filed court cases, press releases, and other information involving multiple sponsoring agencies in multiple jurisdictions. And based on this publicly available information, we have identified 3 aspects of SBIR regulations that are subject to scrutiny. First, the strict SBIR subcontracting limitations. As we know, under Phase 1, 2/3 of the work must be performed, at least 2/3 of the work must be performed at the small business. 1/3 may be subcontracted to a university, though it is not required. In Phase 2, no more than 50% can be formed at a university. A second key issue subject to scrutiny are affiliation issues. Affiliation issues involve when another entity is deemed to be an affiliate of that small business. Then they are treated as essentially one for evaluating whether this size meets the criteria of a small business. And the third area that has been subject to scrutiny has been the principal investigators themselves. Under the SBIR regulations, the principal investigator for a small business must be a full-time employee, at least 51% of the small business. In fact, the government has brought cases against full-time faculty members who started their own business and who also served as the PI of the small business. So now let's take a look at, okay, that worked, that's good. Let's take a look at some recent trend of false claims prosecutions of university faculty members that were primarily based on misrepresentation of ownership interests and maintaining full-time faculty positions. And by looking at 2 sample cases, I think we can learn a lot from these prosecutions. The first is the USV Cyber Quest case that was brought in the Southern District of California. This involved Professor Dr. Kerry Mabadi, who was both the Chief Executive Officer and the Chief Technology Officer of his company, CyberQuest. At the same time, he was employed as a full-time professor at the University of California at San Diego. CyberQuest was awarded $6.4 million under 22 separate grants or contracts, 8 of which were SBIR grants with a value of about $1.8 million. Now, to obtain the CyberQuest grants or contracts, the government found that the professor made false statements to government officials, falsely certifying that he was primarily employed by CyberQuest when he was actually a full-time professor at UC San Diego, and failing to disclose all current and pending awards. Based on the government's investigation, the government brought charges of wire fraud against the company and Dr. Kerry Mabadi. Ultimately, this led to a plea agreement. The company pled guilty. Dr. Kerry Mabadi entered into a deferred prosecution agreement. And what this basically is an agreement between the government and the criminal defendant, where the defendant admits to the underlying facts constituting the offense of the crime, but the government decides to withhold entry of judgment for a period of time based on the defendant complying with certain conditions. Dr. Kerry Mabadi complied with those conditions, so the government did ultimately dismiss the case against him, but it did get a guilty plea from the company and had the individual in the company forfeit $180,000. The other case I want to mention is USV Ding. In this case, Professor Ding, was a tenured professor at Lehigh University, just about 2.5 hours away from here. Professor Ding set up a company called ArcLight to apply for SBIR funding. ArcLight's only office was at Professor Ding's home. The government found that the company was fraudulent. Lehigh's Office of Research and Sponsored Programs sent a subcontract proposal to Professor Ding's wife for an SBIR Phase 2 proposal that ArcLight was preparing to submit to NASA. Professor Ding's wife was listed as the principal investigator for this project. Lehigh thought it was going to be doing a portion of the work under the project in accordance with the SBIR subcontracting limitations. In reality, all of the work was being done at Lehigh. The government found that Professor Ding actively concealed from Lehigh his affiliation with ArcLight and the PI, who was his wife, and the fact that ArcLight was merely a shell company to receive SBIR funding. NASA awarded funding to ArcLight for the Phase 2, but neither ArcLight nor his wife did any work on the project. Rather, all the work was done in Professor Ding's lab at Lehigh by a grad student. Excuse me, the government ended up bringing 10 counts of wire fraud against Professor Ding. Essentially, every time he submitted payment via electronic transmission in an invoice to NASA for payment constituted a new count of wire fraud. The government also charged Professor Ding's wife. This resulted in a jury trial where Professor Ding was convicted on 6 counts. Professor Ding was sentenced to 1 year in prison in order to repay money to the government. Professor Ding's wife was also convicted in order to serve 3 months in prison in order to pay restitution. So the bottom line, from these enforcement actions that we see here is that the government means business in its ongoing attempt to combat fraud, waste, and abuse in the SBIR space. So, based on these, looking at these cases, and in light of the strict, in light of the strict subcontracting limitations, increased government scrutiny, and recent enforcement actions, but also just based on fundamental principles of ethics and compliance, the university decided to create 2 new policies, one for SBIR collaboration and the other for STTR collaboration for the university research community. The policies were rolled out on April 26, 2017, and they are both publicly available on Penn State's policy website. Each policy contains 11 general principles in each separate policy. And the policies, put federal regulations, existing university policies, such as the use of university resources in proposal submission and conflict of interest principles, and bright line rules in one place for one-stop shopping, if you will, when university faculty and staff are involved with SBIR and STTR grants, and to provide notice to our important small business collaborators as well. And personally, I think Penn State is unique here. We have created 2 separate policies to account for the differences in the programs, also to allow a bit more flexibility under the STTR guidelines. Most peer institutions only have a single policy for SBIR and STTR. So we are somewhat innovative here. See, even lawyers can be innovative, right? So why don't we take a quick look at some of the policies here, just some of the highlights, and I will, Okay, let me just minimize this and open up the policy so we can just take a look at some of the key points together. Can you see that? Okay. All right, we're just going to go down. All the policies are pretty much set forth in the same manner: purpose, background, definition, scope. But I want to turn to the general principles that I mentioned. And if you can see that there, starting with general principle number 1. This simply restricts work using in university facilities to appropriate agreements and arrangements that are already required by other university policies. As a general rule, the compliance processes can only work if there is an awareness of what activities are taking place, here using university agreements run through the appropriate channels. In the context of SBIR compliance specifically, this is especially important due to the strict subcontracting limitations we discussed. Requiring all such small businesses using university facilities to go through the proper channels also ensures that it goes through the embedded and robust compliance process here at Penn State, such as conflict of interest and others. And I note, and though I'm not going to switch over to it, the general principle number 1 in the STTR policy is the same. Focusing now on the second general principle. This general principle draws a bright line, prohibiting, for example, a Penn State researcher from performing work at the university on a subcontract from a small business that he or his spouse owns. This is the Professor Ding situation at Lehigh. This bright line also helps ensure compliance with subcontracting limitations. I note, however, in general principle number 2 in the STTR policy, it's not as much of a bright line because more can be contracted by the small business and also because this STTR program requires collaborative research. Under general principle number 3, here the university wants to ensure that adequate controls are in place to mitigate against the use of university resources outside the scope of the subcontract. All universities really have to be cautious when one wears 2 hats. That is both as a university researcher and as a consultant directly from the same company. This principle is designed to address that. We'll skip down to general principle number 5. This is right from the federal regulations. The SBIR programs require that the PI for the small business be a full-time employee of the small business. General principle number 6 basically says that the PIs can't be the same person because the PI for the small business must be a full-time employee of the small business. And general principle number 8, take a quick look at that. This is really a pro-student general principle. We don't want professors perhaps taking advantage of students like Professor Ding did with his graduate student at Lehigh. And lastly, the last one before moving on to Clint here, is general provision number 11. This provision provides instruction and a mechanism for bringing potential important information into the compliance process and to alert appropriate administrators. We only know what we know, and we ask people to report things as they come up. So that's the lead-off of our presentation today. And let me go back to our Here we go. Let me turn it over to Clint now. Thank you very much. Thanks.
So thanks everyone who's hanging in here towards the end of a long day. Like James and David said, these are some important things that we all have to talk about. And I can keep my part pretty quick. I would just want to cover a few really key points about conflicts of interest, and David already went over some of the general principles in those 2 policies aimed at SBIRs and STTRs, and so John's office and my office are the ones that primarily implement those policies and apply those general principles to different on a case-by-case basis, let's say, to different scenarios. So when we talk about conflicts of interest, we're talking about people's outside financial interests, outside of Penn State, potentially interacting with and impacting or creating the perception that they could impact their work here at the university. Pardon me. And this it's focused mainly on objectivity in research. So we don't want to think people are biasing their work here, but we also want to protect human subjects from people taking unnecessary risks with their research. If you're doing biomedical research or any kind of clinical studies, you don't want the public to think that you exposed human subjects to a higher level of risk than was necessary because you're motivated by profit, by the interest of moving your company forward. And similarly with students, we don't want students to feel that their academic progress has been hampered in any way by their advisors' entrepreneurial efforts. So we are, and actually the last point up here, preserving public trust, that's a really important one too, not just for the reasons that I just mentioned about students and objectivity in general, but we go through cycles in this country, and right now I'd say we're in one where there's a lot of skepticism and doubt among the public about the value of federally sponsored research. So anything we can do to make it, to bolster the integrity of it and to dispel those doubts, to avoid criticism, is important for us to do. And when you're talking about people starting up companies, you just don't want the public accusing researchers of mismanaging funds, even if it's completely baseless. So that's where we come in and we talk about perceptions, and that's the big the biggest part of what conflict of interest is focused on. Okay, so everyone hears the word conflict of interest and they get scared, they think it's a bad thing, and they're worried about getting in trouble. We kind of have to use the terminology, even though it's not appealing to a lot of people for us to say you have a conflict of interest, but that's just the way it's referred to among all research institutions and across the federal sponsoring agencies. But it's not a bad thing to have a conflict. It's actually pretty normal. There are a lot of researchers at Penn State and at all universities that have a conflict of interest, and we're just seeking to manage the conflict to help promote transparency. And essentially, at the end of the day, we're here to help. Our office is here to help. We want people to come talk to us so that we can help you arrange the structure of your contracts and everything to avoid what we would call unmanageable conflicts. David talked a little, and I'm going to get to this on a future slide, but David talked about some of the restrictions in the SBIR and STTR policies. And if you come and talk to our office, or John's for that matter, and before you submit the proposal, we can help you avoid some of the things that would be a deal breaker, basically, for Penn State policy. One important point is that any amount of ownership, any amount of equity in a startup company, whether it's an LLC, an S-Corp, a partnership, or anything, qualifies as a significant financial interest. So for any Penn State researchers starting a company, that's something that has to be disclosed in our conflict of interest system, COINS. It doesn't matter if it's worth $0, that's almost always the case when you start a new company. And it doesn't matter if it's not profitable yet, it's still a significant financial interest, because that's where, with startup companies, that's where you can see the explosive growth at some point in time when the company really starts to take off. So one of the biggest, most important thing I can say about those general principles that David was talking about, and as far as contracting at Penn State with SBIRs and STTRs, is that if you have a small company getting an SBIR and you want to contract at Penn State, you can't have anything to do with that subaward on the Penn State side. You can't be involved even with zero effort or zero salary. So anyone with a financial interest in the company can't have involvement here. On an SBIR, on an STTR, because of the expectation of working with an academic research institution, you can be involved, you just can't be the only person involved. A person who's an owner of the company can be the PI on an STTR sub at Penn State, but you have to have a co-investigator or a co-PI. So that's a pretty easy fix. Another thing that you should avoid, which isn't specifically prohibited, but is usually not the best idea, is having your spouse as the PI at the company if you're going to be working on the Penn State subaward, because in a lot of ways under law and also under university policy, spouses are treated as one and the same when it comes to outside financial interests. As a very good example, your spouse's financial interests are considered yours if they're related to the work you do here at Penn State. So in the eyes of the government also, having spouses on one spouse on one end of the contract and the other one on the other just doesn't look like there's much separation there. Sometimes people want their spouse to be the PI at the company because it's just a natural fit and they can avoid having to hire a more expensive CEO, but there are definitely some pitfalls and reasons to avoid doing that, if you can. And David talked about professors being caught with running a company out of their home, and that's basically a red flag to the government, and it also raises a question about whether your company can even do the work it says it's going to do, which then leads to the inference that you might be using university facilities without paying for them. So if your company wants to use university facilities or equipment for any reason, it has to pay for them. There are ways to contract for that, but you need to go through the proper channels here, like sponsored programs or your college research office. And finally, the main point of everything I'm trying to say is to just be transparent, keep all your cards on the table, and talk to us as early as you can, because we're here to help, and the more we know, the earlier, the better. And if you start a company, if you're a Penn State researcher, disclose it in coins. Make sure to say yes to questions about owning an outside financial interest on various forms you fill out, like a proposal form, IRB, IACUC, any of those kinds of compliance-related forms. Well, not IACUC, there's not a question in there, but IRB and the IAF for proposal routing. Make sure your department head knows what you're doing. And the last bullet point about the government, tell the sponsor, if you're subcontracting to or from your company, make sure the sponsor knows that you own that company at the time when you're submitting the proposal. Don't keep them in the dark, and then we'll be required to tell them later, and they may have an adverse reaction to that. It's usually better to have that discussion up front. And coistaff@psu.edu is the email address to ask questions or tell us about anything. With that, I'll turn it over to John.
Okay. Bottom line, why we're having this conversation is because SBIR subcontracts are hard. They're not an easy thing to do, and we need to be straightforward about that. 2 hours ago, I received a $1.5 million award from the U.S. Department of Energy. It's not an SBIR, it's just a cooperative agreement, and I shrugged my shoulders because we'll be able to process that in maybe 1 or 2 business days. It's a simple, easy thing to do. But when we receive a Phase 1 SBIR subcontract for $30,000, our hearts sink a little bit because there are a lot of issues that we need to pay attention to. One set of issues are the issues that David talked about, where we know that there is a lot of scrutiny, where the government wants to see proper separation. And then another set of issues are the issues that Clint was talking about, where we have to have conflict of interest disclosures if there is, in fact, a financial conflict of interest. And to just vet all of those issues takes time. We have a checklist that we use in the Office of Sponsored Programs to make sure those 11 principles that David articulated in the SBIR and SGTR policies are being followed. Does the small company have their own facilities? Do they have their own personnel? Are they going to be able to do that percentage of the work that they are required to be able to do as an independent standalone company? Are we confident that they're not really going to be doing all of the research in the Penn State lab using Penn State personnel and Penn State facilities? And by using that checklist that we developed with David Dulabon's help, we're able to vet those issues, but it can take time to ask those questions of the people who know the answers and document that everything is clean and that we're not exposing our faculty members or our students or anyone else to any risk in that area. The conflict of interest issues also take time. The Conflict of Interest Committee meets periodically, but they don't meet every day. And so if we find out at the last minute that there is a financial conflict of interest, it may be a while until that group can convene and look at the situation and identify are there any mitigating strategies that can be put in place so that we can manage that conflict. Again, not saying that conflicts are inherently bad, but it does take some thought to make sure that we do have the proper separation and that the objectivity in research is going to be preserved. If those were the only issues that we had to worry about with SBIRs and SDTRs, that would take time. But we also have the fact that our Phase 1 SBIRs are only 6 months long, And we don't want to cut into those 6 months by putting conflict of interest plans in place and going through checklists. And then there's also the contract itself. Somebody has to read it. Small companies sometimes have experience with reviewing federal contracts and issuing subcontracts under those contracts. Sometimes they don't have a lot of experience with that, and they need help. And there are some unique challenges that we see in these contractual documents that also requires time. So the first point is that we need all the lead time that we can get. If you come to us a week before the start date of your Phase 1 SBIR and are hoping that we can put it all in place in 1 week, we will try. We will try. But there is a lot to do. Your agreement is likely to have FAR clauses from the Federal Acquisition Regulation. It's going to be a thick document that needs to be reviewed, and then we need to put the right terms and conditions in place between the small company and the university. And doing that in a week or 2 weeks is not always possible. Sometimes it takes longer than that. The thing that we do to help, the second issue here, is if a company is inexperienced, Penn State will try to help you as much as you're willing to let us help you. You can send to us, as a small company, a copy of the agreement that you received from the federal government, and we will read it, and we will try to write a subcontract from you, the small company, to ourselves at Penn State. We obviously are not legal counsel. The fact that we are operating in good faith and trying to be fair-minded to our small company partners is not a substitute for having your own legal representation. So I would never suggest that a small company should just trust that we're not going to make any mistakes or that we understand everything that you, as the prime recipient of those federal funds, needs to know. But what I can tell you is we are trained to treat our small company partners fairly. We really are. We do not want to see any of our small company partners fail or suffer. And it doesn't matter whether it's a small company that has some type of affiliation with Penn State, whether they have licensed Penn State intellectual property, whether the company was started by a Penn State faculty member, or whether it's a company completely unrelated to Penn State. That doesn't matter to us, because a part of our mission at Penn State is we are supposed to be supporting economic development. We're supposed to be supporting job creation, and the way that we do that is by helping small companies succeed. So as an example, there are times when a small company will receive an SBIR agreement from the U.S. Department of Defense, and it will include a publication restriction in it. Then they will issue a subcontract to Penn State, and we will take exception to the publication restriction. And then 15 minutes later, the company emails us back, and they say, okay, we took it out. That worries us when the company responds too quickly, because it suggests to us that they didn't really go back to their contracting officer to get that approved. And they are likely to get in trouble with their contracting officer if there is something that they were supposed to include in their subcontract to Penn State that they didn't. So we don't have any privity of contract with the U.S. government in that case. We could just accept the subcontract from the small company without a publication restriction in it, and then we wouldn't be required to subject our publications to prior approval. But we don't want the small company getting in trouble because they gave us something that we wanted too easily. So we will go back to the small company in that situation, and we'll say to them, you know, you really do need to, under the prescription of this clause that defines how the clause works in federal contracting, you have to go back to the contracting officer, and you have to get a written determination letter from the contracting officer saying that the publication restriction does not apply to the university subrecipient. You need all that in writing. You can't just take it out of our subcontract and begin work tomorrow. Everyone would love to just begin work tomorrow, but we don't want you getting in trouble for violating the terms of your contract. Again, not the same thing as legal representation, not saying that we won't ever make a mistake, but we do honestly try to be good partners to small companies and help you do what you need to. And if that involves us helping to write the subcontract to Penn State, we will help with that. If you want to redact budgets or certain aspects of the scope of work that you don't want us to see, we don't care. We really just need to see the contractual components of that so that we have what we need to be able to draft a subcontract. And then, of course, you'll have an opportunity as a small company to review that and to put it by whatever type of legal service or legal representation that you have to make sure that it does meet your needs. The last issue, last slide here, is about some of the particular problems that we have with the U.S. Department of Defense. We do an enormous amount of work at Penn State with the U.S. Department of Defense. It is our largest sponsor. And specifically as it relates to the SBIR and STTR program, we receive a lot of subcontracts, SBIR and STTR subcontracts, that are DoD flow-through. The challenge is that these contracts often include clauses that are difficult and in some cases impossible for universities to accept. They will frequently include restrictions on the right to publish. They'll often include foreign national restrictions. They will often include extensive and expensive data security requirements. When we receive those, and this is one of the reasons why our hearts skip a beat when we see a DoD SBIR come into the office, when we see these, we need to first evaluate whether or not those restrictions make sense in the context of what the university is being asked to do. So if the work that we're being asked to do at Penn State involves control technology, technology that's listed on the munitions list or the commerce control list, and it really is the type of work that needs to be done in a restricted space under these types of contractual restrictions, we will accept it. Some universities won't do that work, but as a university that works regularly with the U.S. Department of Defense, we will accept restrictions if the scope of work warrants it, if the technology is really controlled. But we can't do it quickly. It takes time to put a technology control plan in place. That's what it's called. It's a plan that makes sure that both from a physical security point of view and an IT security point of view, that the work can be protected to prevent unlicensed foreign nationals from accessing that technology. And one of the reasons why it's not easy is because universities aren't built for that type of work. 69% of the graduate students in Penn State's College of Engineering are foreign nationals. So most of the spaces where we have most of our labs have foreign nationals in them. To segregate space where foreign nationals aren't present is difficult under the best of circumstances. And for any of you who are familiar with some of the shared spaces that we have in Millennium Science, you sometimes can't identify a good space to do the work that can be properly controlled. If we can do it, if we can segregate the space, if we can put the data security provisions in place, if we have U.S. national personnel who can perform the work, we will put these plans in place. But if it takes 3 weeks, 4 weeks, 5 weeks to put that in place, that's cutting into the 6 months that you have to perform your phase 1. And those are precious months for you, because if you don't get enough done in your phase 1, you're not going to get your phase 2. That's why we need to really plan ahead for those situations. Any lead time that you can give us to start working on that prior to the issuance of your phase 1, we need that time. The flip side of this is that if your project does not involve controlled technology, or if the university portion specifically does not include controlled technology. We're not going to accept the publication restrictions or the foreign national restrictions or the extra data security provisions. Our obligation to the public good means that we always publish our research results, except in those circumstances where national security reasons prohibit us from being able to do so. We're not going to discriminate against our foreign students, like the 69% of our students in the College of Engineering who are foreign nationals. We're not going to do that if the technology that we're using is open technology. So what we would need to do in those circumstances is get that written determination letter that I was mentioning earlier from the Department of Defense contracting officer saying what you're doing at the university does not involve controlled technology, and therefore these restrictions on foreign national access and publication do not apply to you. An important distinction there is the terms don't have to be the same for the small company as they are for the university. A very common scenario is where the university researchers are doing fundamental research. They're doing work on technologies that are broadly published. That information is out there, and it's intended to be published for the benefit of everyone. But then what the small company is going to do is take that technology from the university and apply it to perhaps a military device or a device that has some military application. So they may be doing controlled work in the small company, and they may need to make sure that they have secure space, data security, no unlicensed foreign nationals, etc. But meanwhile, even as they're controlling their portion of the work, which may truly be controlled, the university may be doing work that is fundamental research and shouldn't be subject to those controls. So the best thing that you can do at the proposal stage, if you're looking to submit a proposal to the U.S. Department of Defense, is have that conversation before the proposal ever goes in, and write it into your proposal. Explain in your proposal, these are the 4 tasks that we hope to accomplish. And the university is going to be working on tasks 1 and tasks 3, which are completely fundamental based on technology that is out there in the public domain. And then the company is going to be doing tasks 2, 3, and 4, and 2 and 4 involve applying this to control technologies. If that is what, in fact, you're doing, articulating that in the proposal gives us something to point to when we're going back to the contracting officer and trying to get their help in identifying what terms and conditions are appropriate for the university and what terms and conditions are appropriate for the small company. And we want to partner with you to get to that as quickly as we can, but those issues do take time. So I think all of us have said, come to us often, come to us early, keep coming back, and we want to help you just in any way that we can. And with that, we have reserved 11 minutes for questions, so I'll sit down, and any of the 3 of us would be happy to entertain any questions that you have.
John?
I have a question. It's a common scenario where a faculty member will be working in their laboratory on an innovative new technology. They've developed a specialized piece of equipment. It's expensive, not easily replicated out in their SBIR company, and they're interested, if they do receive an SBIR award, to subcontracting back to get access to this special piece of equipment. Is that an intractable problem, or are there solutions that allow access? Because in that case, there wouldn't necessarily be a charge-out rate, and there'd be a conflict because of the policy. Are those kind of no-go type of situations, or are there scenarios where that conflict can be managed?
Seen that?
So, yeah, thank you for that very difficult question. You may not have a charge-out rate established, but you could seek to establish one. You can try to see whether that very valuable equipment could be established in a user facility, subject to somebody else's supervision, who would be able to provide you with that arm's length and be able to provide that service not just to the SBIR small company, but to any other party that might be interested in coming and paying that charge-out rate to reimburse the university for the use of that equipment. Even if that equipment has been purchased using federal funds, we are allowed to, in fact, encouraged to make that technology available for use on other projects and to private companies that want to come in and pay for it under proper terms of reimbursement. There may be some circumstances where that's not possible, but we can work toward trying to see whether, if the equipment really is as valuable as your scenario suggests, could it be the basis of a new user facility? That might be a good solution. A second option, if that first option isn't going to work, which would be, I think, more disappointing to a lot of people, but could get you out of the problem, is as long as you don't have the only one of that kind of equipment in the world, but there's also somebody at University of Michigan who has no relation to your SBIR project who can provide that testing service for you or whatever other type of analysis that could be done with that equipment. Instead of bringing the money back to your own lab, you could send it off to somebody else. It becomes more difficult if it's custom and that doesn't exist anywhere else in the world. But it's a real balancing act.
And I would say we're very lucky to have people like John and Clint. The types of scenarios that James just mentioned come up, and the staff, the administrators do a wonderful job working with folks to try to solve problems.
Yeah, and I think the related question is, what's a reasonable lead time for those type of creative solutions, right? For a charge-out rate or trying to get a piece of equipment moved to a user facility, because I think quite often, it's right around when the awards are issued is when those problems come to the surface, and then, it creates significant delay, but for valid reasons.
One thing I can say is, for anybody who's been working with Penn State for a long time, you may have heard that it takes us a really long time to put a charge-out rate in place. That used to be true. We've become much better at doing that. Our cost analysis group is more well-staffed than they used to be. It used to be the case that once a year when they were calculating our indirect cost rate, they would shut down for about a month and not do any more charge-out rates because they didn't have enough people to do it. But they don't do that anymore. They don't shut down once a year for a month to work on the indirect cost rate. They will work on charge-out rates with you throughout the year, and they're doing a much better job than what you may have heard 3 years ago or 5 years ago in turning those around.
And from for the conflict of interest committee, John mentioned they meet periodically. They meet on the third Friday of every month. So they're meeting tomorrow, actually. But we closed the agenda on Tuesday of this week, and if a person came to us with new information that needed to be reviewed on Tuesday, that wouldn't be enough time because we probably have to go back and forth with them a little bit, and some of our questions may mean that they have to then talk to John's office or to their federal sponsor or any number of things. So really, I would say a month of time is a good rule of thumb to go by to get us information. We can usually work with less than that, but it just comes down to the specific cases, facts of the case and how much back and forth needs to be done. But definitely, our official deadline for getting something on the committee agenda is the Wednesday 9 days before the committee meeting, but we usually squeeze stuff in later than that. But I would say a month. A rule of thumb is a month at least.
Hi, John.
Hi.
Some of these timing issues where you say your heart skips the beat because you get the award and it's a DoD, SBIR, and they want things, the award's already in the door of the agency. Some of that would be not a problem if the company came to you before they submitted it and had a subcontract proposal to submit with the application, which I didn't even hear you suggest. But I know, I've done some reviews, I know that's the ideal case. So do you want to just comment on that?
Oh, yeah, so I mean, I intended to comment on that in part when I suggested that the scope of work should identify what the university is doing, what the small company is doing, which components of the work may be controlled, and which ought to be considered fundamental research. And that would indicate that the small company and the university were working together to write that proposal. But if there was a proposal from the university as the proposed subrecipient to the small company, which then incorporates the university's subcontract proposal in what they submit to the government, then we do have at least that information. Whatever was included in the proposal, we know about that at the time of the proposal. So that's very helpful. Thank you, Lorraine. And good to see you.
Any final questions for our panel? Well, if not, let's give John, David, and Clint a round of applause.